This short video will show you how to do a pivot table in a Google Sheet. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The data that I'm going to be looking at here is the Western United States wind data. This data includes several hundred weather stations across the Western United States and also wind speeds for various months of the year. If you're going to do simple summaries, you can use formulas. So for example, if I wanted the average throughout the year for this particular weather station, I could just use a formula here, equal average, and that could easily be obtained. However, if I want to compute many summaries, okay, or maybe summaries that are a little bit atypical, so maybe I want to compute the average of these values here and these values here. Okay, so these would be wind speeds throughout the winter time. Maybe I want the average of those. That's going to be kind of cumbersome to do with formulas, but it's going to be fairly straightforward using a pivot table. Now, one thing about pivot tables is that the data is you're going to want the data in a stacked structure. So what we mean by a stacked structure is that those wind speeds are all in a single column here. So what we have done is taken the data that I had originally here. Those various wind speeds are in a variety of columns, so columns C through N it looks like. I want to put those all into a single column. So those values now have been placed into column D here. Now I do need to associate each month with those, so I have the corresponding months along with their wind speeds. And we did that for all of the weather stations in this data set. Okay, so let's show you how to use a pivot table now to compute various summaries. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're doing a pivot table is highlight the data that you want to summarize. Oops, so we'll do that there. So I'm going to go ahead and include all of the data in the spreadsheet. I'm going to go underneath data up here and then say pivot table. It's going to ask you what data do you want to summarize, and I've already determined that, or I highlighted that at the beginning. Do you want to put this information, this pivot table, into a new sheet, which is usually the safest thing to do so that doesn't mess up the data that you're working with currently. So here I'm on a new sheet now. This one happens to be called Pivot Table 7, it looks like. And we have items in rows, columns, and also values in a pivot table. So let's start with values. The values is kind of the heart of the table. So let's suppose I wanted to compute the average wind speed across the entire data set. So just give me one value for this entire column here. For this wind speed column, give me just one average. So I'm going to accomplish that under values here. I'm going to add an attribute, and I'm going to say wind speed. You're going to have to specify what kind of summary you want done. So the default here is a sum. I don't want that. I want an average. So the average wind speed across the entire data set across all weather stations in all months is 7.85. Now let's suppose that I wanted that average broken out maybe by state. So now I want to take this wind speed information and I want to get an average across each state. So what I would do here is under rows, I'm going to add the state attribute. And that will break out that average wind speed for each state for me. Okay, so rows will create a set of rows for me based on the state here because I've specified that. You could do something in columns as well. So let us suppose that I want to add an attribute of month under columns. Now what that's going to do, it's starting to get a little bit big here, but what that's going to do is calculate the average for me for each state and then for each month as well. And it looks like what Google Sheets has done here is put them in alphabetical order, okay, instead of January being first. And you can move those around. You have the ability to change the order of those columns as well. If I want to take out that month information, I can just say under columns, I can remove the month attribute here with the X. and it'll go back to the one I had here originally. Now you can apply a filter as well. So under filters, I can do that a couple of different ways. I can either apply that on my pivot table. So there's a filters icon here, or you can do that out here as well. So if I highlight these two columns here, under data, create a filter, and maybe I only want certain states listed here. So there I've removed some of the states and I just have information on California, Colorado, Hawaii, etc. You can select all and put those back on. Sometimes you'll get an empty row in a table, so I will deselect blanks. Sometimes that's needed to remove an empty row in a table. I could apply a filter here on wind speed. So maybe I want states where the wind speed is greater than 9 maybe. So again, I do that by filter by condition. I want it to be greater than maybe 9. Say OK. And that filter will be applied then to that pivot table. So you can see that Hawaii, Montana, and New Mexico are the 3 states where the average wind speed across all weather stations is greater than 9. So the pivot table feature is a nice feature inside of spreadsheets. I guess one quick thing, if you want to add, you can add additional attributes under values. So maybe if I wanted to figure out how many weather stations there were, I could do a count. So here you can add additional summaries if you want. Okay. So here I'm counting how many weather stations, I guess, there are in Hawaii, Montana, and New Mexico. Let me turn that filter back off here. Oops. Let's go ahead and just turn the filters off. Easiest way to do that is up here. So you can see that Alaska has the most number of weather stations, which makes sense because that's the largest state that we have. Okay, so that's how to accomplish or use pivot tables inside of Google Sheets. Thank you.